Hi, Gen Xers. Hello, Millennials. And hopefully, maybe a few Ys are watching. I want to tell you a little bit about what a real childhood was for a Gen Xer. Because of the era we were living in, we were far from the silent generation. The silent generation was our parents. They were raised to be seen and not heard, and when they were seen, they were to be still. And they could be spanked in public in front of anybody for disobeying. That was the boomers' generation of childhood. But when those boomers grew up, they cast off that. I spoke out as a child. I had a voice. I was part of a generation, if I'm now Generation X, because they're tampering with the timeline. They're trying to shut me up. They're thinking, if they make me now one of the Gen Xers, it'll shut me up. Wrong. I was one of the Gen Xers who raised their children. I didn't abandon them and become silent, only to them. Because you were loudmouths, right along with me and everybody else from my generation. Slim Sherry, you have lied so much and manipulated your own history, I'm wondering if you might actually believe it. The children of the silent parent generation. Silent parent generation. Get it right. Those kids were neglected. Those kids were abused. Those kids suffered. And now, Gen X, from this small clique, is trying to use Stockholm Syndrome in an effort to get those children to protect and defend them. See, my generation remembers Stockholm Syndrome. We saw it in our parents as they were going in and out of wars. We saw it in our parents when they were going in and out of good and bad economies. We saw it in our parents when they tried to relate to us. But they couldn't tell us the horrors they had really lived through. So they seemed angry all the time to us, Gen Xers. We were not an oppressed generation. Generation X was one of the most outspoken generations that ever existed in the U.S. That's the real story of Gen X. Now, the bad kids like Slim Sherry climbing out the window to go party, I started out with that clique, and my parents said, no way! Whooped my butt, grounded me, and then when I did it again, they sent me to somebody who could ground me mentally, my grandmother. And if you think she did not put the fear of God in me, she did. And I'm grateful she did, because otherwise I'd be on here screaming like shit, Slim Sherry, that my millennial children are the most ungrateful generation for everything that they have, that their parents didn't have any of that. That's bullcocky. They had it. Their parents were giving them the best of what America had to offer, because sometimes the economic booms even allowed my boomer parents to buy their first home. Listen, I'm tired of millennials being lied to. Gen X was the voice of reason against our government. Gen X was the big mouths shouting to desegregate all our schools, all our colleges, and to give equal rights to everyone. That was our generation. And she wants to say we were silent? When? Where? Do a little bit of American history over the last 50 years. I'm almost 60. So let's do this. Come on, Gen X. If you were part of the silent generation, why? Because you got in so much trouble you had no voice. You were losing your children in record numbers. And you were going and filling up our jails and filling up our prisons with your nonsense, thinking you had a right to rebel against the way the world works and refusing to be a part of it. So if you went unheard in my Gen X generation, it was because you were shut up by our government, put in jail, where you belong, because you were violent, drug, and drunk all the time. You had no idea what rationality was. So don't tell me you were the silent generation, because it was probably your kind throwing eggs at my uncle and shouting baby killer when he got off the plane to come home from war after being burned half of his body by napalm. That was you, wasn't it? Here's some eggs back at you. Silent generation, my ass. And if you call being the silent generation the abusive generation, the neglectful generation, I have the numbers to prove I'm right. Shut up. You do not deserve recognition for ignoring, abusing your children, because that's the only people you were absent from. Your big mouths were running everywhere, and when you discovered social media, here you are. Look, not all Gen Xers, and this is where the hate's coming from, grew up like Slim Shady. Our parents did feed us. Yes, we did play in garden hoses. Yes, we were rebellious kids. But in that rebellious kids, we forced women's rights. We forced black people's rights. We forced our government to acknowledge us as citizens. And we were abused and beaten down by our government, but we didn't shut up until they changed laws that this next generation is removing their own freedoms that we gave them by having the biggest mouths in American history. Gen X generation was the movement for freedom in America. That's what we were. We weren't silent. You could not be silent to fight for your civil rights or somebody else's civil rights. Do you know how many people joined the Panther movement that was equally as big as the hippie movement? They were white, but they thought it was wrong to oppress anybody. And now a woman like Slim Shady wants to come out and say, no, we were silent, we were cold, we had no voice, we couldn't speak. Bullshit! We were the loudest hippie generation that ever existed in the U.S. because our parents were the last of the silence. And we weren't going to let it come back. They didn't deserve to be the silent generation when they kept the Germans from taking over our country. And they kept Japan from taking over our country. Our women came up and fought by making weapons. Our men went and died in record numbers. So our generation fought for them. We fought against slavery. And we never have been recognized for it. But you don't hear us crying about it. Yet you hear the silent Generation X, who was only silent and absent to their own children, screaming they need credit for what they did. They didn't do anything to deserve the credit they're asking for. And millennials need to stop listening to these lies. Listen to some of the real Gen Xers. Not this, as my grandmother would call it, piece of malarkey. My grandmother was a Southern woman. And by the way, my mother really did walk to school, barefoot in rags, until her mother loaded up her family after losing 4 of her kids to tuberculosis, moved them to Chicago, and started a life there, filled with poverty. But at least her children had food because there were resources available, like the wonderful place I knew as a kid called Erie House in Chicago. It was the savior of that community's families. Don't listen to this small version of people coming on here to get clicks, millennials, because they started out this attacking you, calling you ignorant, saying you were stupid, saying you had no intelligence at all, because of things they didn't teach you that my parents taught me. Like how to fill a tire with air. Something simple. I could change my own tires by the time I was 15. All four. I knew how to rotate them so I didn't get too much tire wear. I'm sorry this Gen X, silent Gen X, abandoned you and didn't teach you these things. And now they want to mock you on social media, laughing at what you don't know how to do and don't understand because they didn't bother. Well, a lot of Gen X parents did bother because we wanted our kids to grow up being the next generation that was going to fight for Americans' rights. I don't forgive you, Gen X, silent generation. And neither should your children. Until you take responsibility for once in your own life. Maybe then the forgiveness can start. And the scolding you're getting about spewing your lies can stop. Because my Generation X was vocal, we were loud, and we came together in huge numbers to fight for freedom that this little clique gang, whatever you want to call it, of Gen Xers, benefited from, but didn't do anything to make happen. They were too busy rebelling against their parents. Millennials, you want to know the truth. I see all kinds of videos coming up. Why are they? Why is it? Why is it? Well, here's a Gen Xer telling you why. Our generation was the most powerful generation in America. And people like Slim Shady are diminishing it down to a small clique that had nothing to do with the freedoms they enjoyed. But they sure want to claim credit. What they didn't do, while Gen Xers, real Gen Xers, sit back laughing until we've had enough. And when we've had enough, here comes the big voice of Generation X that existed in larger numbers than your parents who ignored and abused you, who now claim to be silent. Please, I wish that clique would be silent for real. Can't claim something you're not. Have a good one, Slim Shady. I'm not done riding this train. Every millennial is going to actually know that we were not the silent generation. We were the generation that came out in full force, not only against the restrictive parents and restrictive and abusive police, but the government, the ones you cowered from. You tell people you're badasses because of what? No, you shut up because you screwed up so bad. The government threatened to throw you in prison, take your children, and did in record numbers. Childabuse.org. Go look up from 1960 to 1990 what those statistics are. They want you to believe they didn't have school buses. Or if she couldn't ride a local bus, we had public transportation. We didn't have Uber, but we did have buses. And they were cheap. And I only had to carry out somebody's garbage to earn 15 cents to get on a Chicago bus, ride all the way down to Lakeshore Drive, which was miles away from my home, spend the day at the beach, and usually at the beach, there was plenty of change laying around in the sand. And if there wasn't, I'd go to a payphone, and I'd hit 0, and I'd make a collect call that only cost my parents back then 10 cents. This is the real life of Gen X, not this garbage and glorification of bad behavior that they're spewing out there for millennials to see. Millennials, talk to your parents. Ask them what it was like in the 70s. Yeah, because supposedly Gen Xers were hitting teen years in those years. So ask them. They'll tell you. Unless they're part of the silent movement. Because Gen X was never the silent generation. We gave our parents a voice against our government. That's what Gen Xers were. I love y'all. And Slim Sherry, I gotta thank you. You have really brought out a lot of my strengths to be able to come out about how it really was for a Gen X kid. Unless you were super poor, you lived in a decent home, in a suburb, you rode the bus to school just like everybody else, or you walked wherever you wanted to go, and nobody really bothered you. Not like they do now. You can't just get out of your house and go for a walk now. The cops will harass you. My generation, you could. And we tried to stop that because it was happening to us, but in a much more aggressive fashion than what your kids are experiencing today. I don't know how many of my friends went through beatdowns to stay out of the cliques and gangs of your silent movement. It's a movement. It's not a generation. Sorry, Sherry. The truth is going to be known. Because there's plenty of places that can look up the facts if they know what to look for. Angel out.